The year was 1887, and the Arizona Territory had been suffering through its third summer of merciless drought. The sun hung like a white-hot coin in a cloudless sky as Sarah Blackwood crested the final ridge separating the small mining settlement of Copper Springs from the vast emptiness that stretched beyond. Her canvas water pouch, still half full, swung heavily at her side, more water than she would need for where she was going. She paused at the ridge's peak, her threadbare boots finding purchase on the crumbling shale. Turning back, she could just make out the cluster of weather-beaten structures that made up Copper Springs. The saloon, the general store, the assay office, and the dozen or so rough-hewn cabins that housed its dwindling population. Smoke from a single chimney curled upward before dissolving into nothingness, much like her own will to continue. Sarah adjusted her hat, pulling the wide brim lower to shield her eyes. She was 32 years old, though the lines etched deeply around her eyes and mouth told a story of a woman who had weathered far more than her years suggested. Her dress, once a cheerful blue calico, had faded to the same dusty gray as the landscape around her. She carried nothing else save for a small leather pouch tied at her waist and the water. "Nothing left behind," she whispered to the wind, "and nothing ahead." With that, she turned her back on Copper Springs and began her descent into the desert basin below. The terrain grew increasingly hostile with each step, transitioning from rocky soil to a seemingly endless expanse of sand and scrub. By midday, the heat had become a physical weight pressing down upon her shoulders. Her lips cracked, but she refused a sip from her water pouch. There would be no point in prolonging what she had come here to end. Sarah had once been a woman of faith, of hope. She had once been a mother and a wife. Now she was a ghost walking among the living, carrying a burden of guilt and grief that had finally become too heavy to bear. 3 crosses in the small cemetery behind Copper Springs marked where her husband and 2 young children lay, victims of the typhoid that had swept through the settlement the previous winter. But it was not just their deaths that haunted her. It was what had come before, what she had done, the secret that poisoned every waking moment. As the sun began its westward arc, Sarah's steps faltered. The heat shimmer on the horizon played tricks with her vision. A mesquite bush seemed to writhe and transform into the silhouette of a child. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing the mirage to disappear. When she opened them again, the bush was just a bush, its twisted branches clawing at the empty sky. She walked on, her shadow stretching longer behind her. The rational part of her mind knew she should stop, find shade, wait for the cool of evening. But she had not come here to survive. The sun was sinking toward the western mountains when she heard it, a sound so unexpected in this desolate place that at first she was certain it was another hallucination. A thin, reedy cry, barely audible over the whisper of the wind across the sand. She turned slowly, scanning the barren landscape. There it was again, the unmistakable wail of an infant. Sarah stood frozen, certain her mind had finally surrendered to the heat and thirst. But the crying continued, insistent and real. Following the sound, she stumbled toward a cluster of boulders 30 yards to her right. As she drew closer, the crying grew louder, more desperate. In the shadow of the largest boulder, half buried in sand, lay a small bundle wrapped in dirty rags. Sarah fell to her knees beside it, hands trembling as she pulled away the frayed cloth to reveal the red, wrinkled face of a newborn infant, no more than a few days old. Its tiny fists were clenched in silent rage against the world it had been abandoned to. "Dear God," she whispered, her first prayer in months. The baby's skin was hot to the touch, its lips dry and cracked. Death had already begun to claim this fragile life. Without thinking, Sarah uncorked her water pouch and wet her finger, gently moistening the infant's parched lips. The child's cries subsided momentarily as it instinctively sucked at the moisture. Sarah looked around wildly, searching for any sign of who might have left a baby in such a place, but there were only the endless dunes, the scattered rocks, and the indifferent sky. No footprints save her own marred the sand. They had been swept away by the desert wind. A terrible understanding dawned on her. Someone had come here with the same purpose as she had, not to continue, but to end. But they had brought this innocent life with them, condemning the child to their own fate. "No," Sarah said aloud, the sound of her voice strange after hours of silence. "No, this isn't right." She dribbled a few more precious drops of water into the infant's mouth, then carefully wrapped it back in the cleanest portions of the rags. Cradling the bundle against her chest, she stood and turned to face the way she had come. Copper Springs was at least a day's journey back, and the water she carried wouldn't last for 2. But the alternative was unthinkable. "Listen to me, little one," she whispered to the whimpering bundle. "We're going back. I don't know if we'll make it, but we're going to try." As the last light faded from the sky, Sarah trudged eastward, using the rising moon to guide her. The infant's weight was slight in her arms, but it anchored her to the present in a way she hadn't felt since burying her family. Each step was a decision to continue, each breath a rebellion against the despair that had driven her into the desert. When the moon reached its zenith, Sarah found a shallow overhang in a rocky outcropping and settled beneath it, shielding the baby from the night wind that had begun to scour the basin. She allowed herself a small sip of water, then dampened a clean corner of her petticoat to moisten the infant's lips again. In the stark moonlight, she examined the child more carefully. It was a girl, small but perfect, with a wisp of dark hair on her crown. There were no identifying marks or tokens left with her, nothing to suggest who her parents might have been or why they had abandoned her to such a cruel fate. "You need a name," Sarah murmured, running a finger along the baby's cheek. "I can't just call you Little One all the way back to Copper Springs." The infant's eyes opened briefly, dark eyes that seemed to hold all the mystery of the night sky. "Hope," Sarah decided. "I'll call you Hope, though God knows there's precious little of that left in this world." The baby made a soft sound, neither agreement nor protest, before drifting back to sleep. Sarah leaned back against the rock, exhaustion washing over her. She hadn't intended to rest for long, but her body had other ideas. As sleep claimed her, the barriers she had built around her memories began to crumble, and she dreamed of the life she had fled, and the terrible choice that had led her to this desolate place. Dawn broke with the distant howl of coyotes. Sarah jerked awake, momentarily disoriented before remembering the child in her arms. Hope was awake, her face scrunched in silent hunger. The situation was dire. Without milk, the infant wouldn't survive much longer, regardless of Sarah's intentions. "We need to move faster," she told the baby, rising stiffly to her feet. "We need to reach Copper Springs by nightfall." The morning heat built quickly as Sarah trudged across the basin. She kept to what little shade she could find, rationing the water with desperate care. By midday, her head pounded and her vision blurred, but she forced herself to continue, one foot in front of the other. As the afternoon wore on, the wind began to rise, driving stinging particles of sand against her skin. On the horizon, she could see a wall of dust approaching, a sandstorm brewing. Panic gripped her heart. There was nowhere to take shelter in this exposed stretch of desert. "Hold on, Hope," she whispered, tucking the baby more securely inside her dress, close to her heart. "Just hold on." Sarah bent her head against the rising wind and pushed forward, each step a battle against the elements. The storm hit with sudden fury, enveloping her in a choking cloud of dust and sand. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, couldn't tell if she was still moving in the right direction. All she could do was keep the setting sun at her back and pray. In the howling chaos of the storm, with hope clutched tightly against her chest, Sarah began to speak. Perhaps it was delirium from heat and thirst, or perhaps it was the certainty that her words would be lost in the wind, but she found herself confessing the secret that had driven her into the desert. "You should know the truth about the woman who found you," she told the infant, her words torn away by the gale. I wasn't always alone. I had a husband, William, and 2 children, Jonathan and Mary. They called me Mama. I loved that word once. The sand whipped around her as she struggled forward, her voice growing stronger as the confession poured out of her. Last winter, typhoid came to Copper Springs. First Jonathan fell ill, then Mary. William worked the mine by day and helped me tend to them by night. We had so little, barely enough medicine for one, let alone 2. Sarah paused, choking on dust and memory. One night, when William had finally collapsed from exhaustion, I sat between their beds, both burning with fever, both needing the last of the medicine. I had to choose, do you understand? A mother had to choose which child might live. The storm seemed to pause, as if listening. I gave it to Mary. She was younger, only 4. I thought she had a better chance. Sarah's voice broke, but I was wrong. They both died, 3 days apart, and William, he never spoke of it, never blamed me. But I saw it in his eyes. He knew what I had done. When he took ill himself, I think he welcomed it. I think he wanted to join them, to escape the life we had left. The wind began to die down, the worst of the storm passing as quickly as it had come. Sarah stood swaying, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. So, you see, Hope, I'm not a savior. I'm not even a proper mother. I'm just a woman who made an impossible choice and has been paying for it ever since. Hope stirred against her chest, making a small, mewling sound. Somehow, she had slept through the storm, protected by Sarah's body. But I promise you this, Sarah continued, her voice steadier now. I won't leave you to die alone in this place. Whatever strength I have left, it's yours now. As the dust settled, Sarah realized with horror that the storm had completely disoriented her. The sun was obscured by the haze of suspended particles, and there were no landmarks visible in any direction. She was lost in the vastness of the desert, with a dying infant and less than a quarter of her water remaining. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm her again. Then Hope began to cry, a sound weaker than before, but still defiant, still alive. Sarah took a deep breath and chose a direction. If she was wrong, they would both die. But they would die together, and somehow that seemed less terrible than the lonely end she had planned for herself. As the last light faded from the sky, Sarah's steps faltered. Her water was gone, her lips cracked and bleeding. Hope no longer cried, conserving what little energy she had left. They had been walking for hours since the storm, with no sign of Copper Springs or any human habitation. A shadow loomed ahead, another rocky outcropping, similar to where they had sheltered the previous night. Sarah stumbled toward it, her legs finally giving way as she reached its base. She curled around Hope, using her body to shield the infant from the night chill that was rapidly replacing the day's heat. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the silent bundle. "I tried." As consciousness began to slip away, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of light in the distance. A star fallen to earth, perhaps, or a final hallucination of her dying mind. She closed her eyes, too exhausted to wonder. The sound of hoofbeats penetrated her delirium some time later, a rhythmic drumming that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her. Then voices, harsh and urgent in the darkness. "Over here! I found something!" Rough hands turned her over, and Sarah forced her eyes open to see a weathered face looming above her, illuminated by the glow of a lantern. "She's alive," the man called over his shoulder, "and there's a baby." More figures materialized out of the darkness. A search party from Copper Springs, she realized dimly. Someone pressed a canteen to her lips, and she swallowed reflexively, the water like liquid life flowing down her throat. "The baby," she managed to croak. "Help the baby first." "Doc's got her," the man assured her, and Sarah turned her head to see an older man bent over Hope, administering drops of water with careful precision. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why did you come looking?" The first man, she recognized him now as Jeremiah Cooper, the owner of the general store, looked uncomfortable. "Found a letter in your cabin," he admitted. "Seemed like a goodbye of sorts. Some folks thought we should let you go, that it was your choice. But my wife," she insisted, "said no one walks into the desert unless they've lost their way, and lost people sometimes need finding." Sarah closed her eyes, a single tear tracking through the dust on her cheek. "The baby? Hope. She needs milk." "We've got a new mother back in town who can help with that," Jeremiah assured her. "Now rest. We'll get you both home." As they lifted her onto a makeshift stretcher, Sarah caught a glimpse of Hope in the doctor's arms. The infant's eyes were open, regarding the night sky with solemn curiosity. Against all odds, she was still fighting. The journey back to Copper Springs passed in a blur of pain and exhaustion. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the rhythmic motion of the horses and the occasional reassurance that Hope was still alive, still with them. Dawn was breaking as they arrived at the settlement. Sarah was carried to the doctor's house, laid in a clean bed, tended to by gentle hands. Through it all, her thoughts remained fixed on the infant she had found in the desert. "Where is she?" she asked whenever she woke. "Where's Hope?" "The baby's doing well," came the repeated answer. "Mrs. Lawson is nursing her. Just rest now." On the third day, Sarah was strong enough to sit up. The doctor, a kind-eyed man named Thomas Granger, sat beside her bed, his expression grave. "The child is recovering remarkably," he told her, "but there's something you should know." Sarah tensed, preparing herself for bad news. When Mrs. Lawson was bathing her, she found something. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, placing it in Sarah's palm. It was a locket, tarnished silver, its chain broken. With trembling fingers, Sarah pried it open. Inside was a tiny portrait of a young woman with dark hair and solemn eyes that matched the baby's, and beside it, etched into the silver, were 2 words: "Forgive me." "There's more, Doctor," Granger said quietly. "Do you remember the Miller family? They lived on the north edge of town until about a year ago." Sarah nodded slowly. "They left after their daughter." She stopped, understanding dawning like a physical pain in her chest. "Rebecca Miller," the doctor confirmed. 19 years old. She disappeared 2 months ago from her family's new home in Tucson. Her parents received a letter last week saying she had done something unforgivable and was going to make it right. They came here looking for her, thinking she might have returned to familiar ground. Sarah stared at the locket, the truth unfolding before her like a map of her own journey. "The baby," she whispered. "Hope is Rebecca's child." Dr. Granger nodded. "It appears so. Born out of wedlock, I'd guess. In these parts, for a young, unmarried woman." "It would have seemed like the end of the world," Sarah finished, her voice hollow. "So she walked into the desert to die, taking her shame with her." "But she couldn't go through with it, not all the way," the doctor said gently. "She left the baby where someone might find her." "Or where she would die more quickly than her mother," Sarah countered, bitterness edging her words. "Wrapped in rags under the desert sun." "Perhaps," Dr. Granger conceded. "We may never know her full intentions. The Millers are due to arrive tomorrow. They'll want to take their grandchild back to Tucson." Sarah closed the locket, its edges biting into her palm. "Of course, she belongs with her family." The doctor studied her face for a long moment. "And what about you, Mrs. Blackwood? What will you do now?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable. Sarah had walked into the desert to die and returned with a reason to live, a reason that would soon be taken from her just as everything else had been. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I haven't thought beyond keeping her alive." That evening, Mrs. Lawson brought Hope to Sarah's room. The baby was transformed, clean, properly swaddled, her cheeks already filling out from regular feedings. Sarah held her close, breathing in the sweet scent of her, memorizing the weight of her in her arms. "The Millers are good people," Mrs. Lawson assured her, misreading the grief in Sarah's eyes. "They'll give her a proper home, a proper life." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. When Mrs. Lawson left, she held the locket up where Hope could see it, the silver catching the last light of day from the window. "This was your mother's," she told the infant softly. "She was lost, just like I was, making impossible choices just like I did, but she loved you enough to leave you this, her plea for forgiveness." Hope's tiny hand brushed against the locket, her dark eyes, Rebecca's eyes, fixed on Sarah's face. "I won't let her sacrifice be in vain," Sarah promised, "and I won't let mine be either." The Millers arrived the next morning, a somber, gray-haired couple worn down by grief and worry. Sarah watched from the window as they entered the doctor's house across the street, their movements weighted with the dual burden of loss and unexpected responsibility. When Dr. Granger came to fetch her an hour later, Sarah was dressed in her faded blue dress, her hair neatly combed, the locket hanging from her neck. The introduction was stilted, heavy with unspoken emotion. Mr. Miller stood by the window, his face a mask of stoic endurance. Mrs. Miller sat with Hope in her arms, tears streaming silently down her weathered cheeks. "We never knew," she kept saying. "We never knew she was in such despair." Sarah sat across from them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I found her. Hope, 3 days' journey west of here. There was no sign of Rebecca." Mrs. Miller nodded, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. "They're organizing a search party in Tucson, but—" "The desert doesn't give up its secrets easily," Mr. Miller finished, his voice rough with suppressed grief. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room, broken only by Hope's occasional coos. Finally, Sarah cleared her throat. "I know you'll want to take your granddaughter home with you," she began carefully, "and you have every right to do so. But I'd like to make a proposal, if I may." The Millers looked at her with wary curiosity. "I lost my family last winter," Sarah continued, "my husband and 2 children. I walked into the desert 3 days ago intending not to return. Finding Hope changed that. She gave me a purpose when I had none." Mrs. Miller's arms tightened protectively around the baby, but she remained silent. "I'm not asking to keep her from you," Sarah clarified quickly. "What I'm proposing is this. Let me come with you to Tucson. Let me help care for her. She'll need more than one pair of hands, especially at her age. And you'll be needing help with the search for Rebecca." Mr. Miller stepped away from the window, his expression thoughtful. "You'd leave your home? Your life here?" Sarah looked around the doctor's sparse room, thinking of her empty cabin on the edge of a dying mining town. "There's nothing for me in Copper Springs now, just memories I've been trying to escape." "And if we find Rebecca?" Mrs. Miller asked, voicing the question that hung between them. "Then Hope will have her mother back," Sarah said simply. "As it should be." The older woman studied Sarah's face, seeming to look beyond the sunburn and lingering exhaustion to something deeper. "You saved her life," she said finally, "our granddaughter's life. That creates a bond not easily broken." "We have a small house," Mr. Miller added, "but there's a room above the kitchen. It's not much, but—" "It's more than enough," Sarah interrupted, hope blooming in her chest for the first time in months. "I don't need much space." Mrs. Miller glanced at her husband, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then she held Hope out toward Sarah. "Would you like to hold her? Your journey together isn't over yet, it seems." Sarah took the baby in her arms, the familiar weight settling against her heart. Hope looked up at her with those solemn dark eyes, Rebecca's eyes, as if recognizing the woman who had carried her out of the desert, who had confessed her darkest secret to the wind and sand. "No," Sarah agreed softly. "Our journey is just beginning." 2 days later, a wagon departed Copper Springs bound for Tucson. In it rode an older couple beginning the difficult process of accepting their daughter's likely fate while embracing the unexpected gift of her child. With them traveled a woman who had walked into the desert to die and returned with a second chance at life. Not a replacement for what she had lost, but a new path forward through her grief. And nestled between them, oblivious to the strange symmetry of loss and discovery that had brought these broken people together, a baby girl slept peacefully, the desert's unforgiving heat already fading from her memory. Sarah's hand found the locket at her throat, its weight a reminder of two mothers' impossible choices, one who had walked away from her child and one who had been unable to save hers. "Forgive me," the locket whispered in its silent silver voice. And for the first time, Sarah thought that perhaps, someday, she might. The desert stretched endlessly on either side of the rutted road, the same merciless expanse that had nearly claimed 2 lives. But now it was behind them, and ahead lay Tucson, and whatever future they would forge together from the broken pieces of their past. Hope stirred in her blankets, reaching up with a tiny hand toward the sun-dappled canvas overhead. Sarah gently caught those fragile fingers in her own. "That's right, little one," she murmured. "Always reach for the light."